Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Tales of Suspense 48, cover dated December of 1963. This issue marks the first appearance of Iron Man's Mark II armor, and the first appearance of obscure villain, Mr. Dahl. The issue was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Steve Ditko and Dick Ayers, and lettered by Sam Rosen. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, teasing Iron Man's coming battle with the wicked Mr. Dahl. But before we can witness such an epic showdown, we must first travel to the executive office of millionaire weapons developer Tony Stark. His secretary Pepper has just informed him that one of their clients, Mr. Carter, has just called off a major deal. Apparently Carter had previously agreed to supply Stark with a major shipment of steel. In desperate need of it, Stark decides to pay the businessman a personal visit, in the hopes of changing his mind. And although he has a personal chauffeur, Stark decides to go drive himself to Carter's mansion. But when he gets there, he spots a strangely dressed figure lurking around the mansion. Assuming he's up to no good, Stark decides to change into Iron Man and investigate. Before we go any further, it should be noted that although it appears rigid, the Iron Man suit is actually quite flexible, allowing Stark to store it in a simple briefcase, which he carries with him at all times. Anyways, just as Stark is done suiting up, he hears a cry of pain coming from the mansion's tower window. So as Iron Man, he flies up to the window, and stumbles onto a strange scene. Inside the tower is Mr. Carter, and the strangely dressed man from outside. It's not exactly clear what's going on, but it seems that the man, who calls himself Mr. Dahl, has been extorting Carter. Using a clay figurine of the businessman's likeness, he's forced Carter to cancel his shipment of steel to Stark's company, and now he's trying to get him to sign a set of papers. It's not clear what Carter would be signing away, but it doesn't matter, as it's then that Iron Man rushes in to stop Mr. Dahl. He hoists the villain into the air with a single arm, and demands to know what's going on, and how he subdued Carter with nothing more than a clay figurine. Instead of answering the questions, Mr. Dahl quickly changes the likeness of the figurine from Carter into Iron Man. Thus it becomes clear that Mr. Dahl's figurine works like a voodoo doll, in the sense that if he harms the figurine, he's also harming the real person it's modeled after. Thus Mr. Dahl simply squeezes the figurine of Iron Man, causing the real hero excruciating pain. Unable to bear it, Iron Man releases Mr. Dahl, and backs away towards the window. But he's not paying attention, and accidentally falls over the tower's balcony. While he luckily plunges into the ocean, Mr. Dahl has caused him so much pain, that he is left motionless and barely conscious for several minutes. But eventually the natural tide washes him ashore, and out of sight of Mr. Dahl. So the villain assumes that he's killed Iron Man, and thus turns his attention back to Carter. While Iron Man has actually survived, he's too weak to confront Mr. Dahl a second time. So after limping back to his car, he hides his armor under normal clothes, and heads back to his office, to recharge the depleted electronic chest plate that's keeping him alive. While he just barely manages to do so in time, he's now so exhausted that he falls asleep, and doesn't wake up till the next day. In fact, the only thing that wakes him up is a call from his secretary Pepper, who's checking up on him. He tells her that he's fine, and that he'd just fallen asleep in his lab after working through the night. He then tells her that he wants to be left undisturbed for the next few hours. He decides to spend that time redesigning his armor, as in its current form, so much power goes to simply supporting its weight, that not enough goes to protecting his weak heart from unnecessary strain. Thus if he's going to defeat Mr. Dahl, he's going to need to design an armor that's just as strong, but far lighter. So as he gets to work on his new suit, let's shift focus to a local police station, where Mr. Carter's being questioned by a pair of detectives. Apparently he signed away his entire business to Mr. Dahl, which the police find very suspicious. They rightly deduce that Mr. Dahl has forced Carter to sign away his business. But unless Carter cooperates, which he isn't, they can't do anything about it. Worse yet, Carter is actually the third millionaire that Mr. Dahl has extorted. But now that he's done with Carter, his next target is Tony Stark. Meanwhile, Stark's just finished his new armor. Like the old one, it's segmented into several collapsible parts, for easy storage. But unlike the old one, many of the parts contain their own batteries, so they can still operate if the main one fails. Another notable change is that Stark has finally given his armor a dash of color. While much of the suit remains gold, its chest plate, belt, gloves, boots, and many other parts are now red. Also something to note is that the suit's leg and arm pieces are made of a metallic fabric, which stiffens when magnetized, although they still afford him great mobility. With the finishing touch of a new helmet, which allows him to show a greater degree of facial expression, Iron Man's new suit is a slick, stylish, and powerful upgrade. And he's finished just in time, as it's then that Pepper activates the office's panic button, signaling an emergency. So Stark changes out of his armor and rushes over to see what's going on. It turns out there's no active emergency, but the police have arrived to speak with him. They tell him what they know about Mr. Dahl and how they think he's going to be his next target. But since they don't actually know how he's been getting his victims to sign over their businesses, the only way they can stop him is to catch him in the act. Thus they've come to emplace an officer to guard Stark and protect him whenever Mr. Dahl shows up. But Stark would rather defeat Mr. Dahl as Iron Man, and he can't change into his armor if an officer's constantly watching over him. So he convinces the police that his own private security is protection enough, and thus theirs won't be necessary. So they leave, but this just means that he now has to find a way to get rid of his own private guard. So he asks his guard, named Bill, to also leave, as he wants to be alone with Pepper when he asks her out. But Bill refuses, as the police ordered him to keep an eye on him at all times. So instead of having Bill leave, Stark decides to take Pepper into another room, which only has one entrance. Thus Bill can guard it from the outside, and be assured that they can't leave without him knowing. Although reluctant at first, Bill eventually agrees to this, and watches as Stark and Pepper walk into the empty room. And once they're inside, Pepper practically pounces on her boss, remarking how surprised and delighted she is that he's asking her out. But in reality, he's not. He just said he was, as an excuse to get away from Bill. And now that he has, he slips out of the room through a secret exit, but orders Pepper to remain there and continue talking to herself, to make it seem that he's still inside. While Pepper's heartbroken by such a cruel twist, Stark's too focused on his mission to even apologize. So after heading to his lab and changing into his new suit, Iron Man returns to Bill and dismisses him from his post. But at that very moment, just outside the factory, which is attached to Stark's offices, Mr. Dahl is taking out the rest of the guards with his moldable figurine. But thankfully someone notices this, and quickly alerts Iron Man. So the hero confronts Mr. Dahl, and although his armor is radically different from the last time they met, the villain still manages to adjust his figurine in only a matter of seconds. Thus when Mr. Dahl twists the figurine's arm, Iron Man feels the agony of such an unnatural movement. But since his new armor is far lighter than his old one, he's better able to resist the pain. Even still, Iron Man knows that the strength of his armor alone will not be enough to defeat Mr. Dahl. So he pretends like he's more hurt than he actually is, and becomes Mr. Dahl's unwitting servant. The first thing the villain has him do is clear the factory of any people, as he's decided that it'll become his new headquarters. After doing this, Iron Man asks Mr. Dahl the origin of his great power. So Mr. Dahl reveals that he'd stolen the secret of his magical figurine from an African witch doctor, who was foolish enough to befriend him. But that's all he gives away, as he then shifts his focus back to the mission at hand. So he changes his figurine's likeness from that of Iron Man to that of Tony Stark. He hopes that by causing the millionaire great pain, he'll be able to lure him out and force him to sign away his fortune. But little does he know that Tony Stark is standing right next to him. Thus when Mr. Dahl begins tormenting his figurine, it's Iron Man who feels the excruciating pain. But if the hero lets out any cries, or does anything to make it seem that he's in pain, he'll expose his identity. So he turns away from Mr. Dahl, and musters every ounce of his willpower to hide the intense agony that he's feeling. Eventually, Mr. Dahl, while still torturing the figure of Tony Stark, orders Iron Man to head into another room, until he's summoned again. So Iron Man flees into his laboratory, and realizes that he knows a way to defeat Mr. Dahl. But he's going to need to build something, which he simply can't do in so much pain. So, to temporarily ease his suffering, he decides to disconnect himself from the electronic chest plate that's keeping him alive. It's a risky move, and he'll only have a few minutes to work. But if he can complete the device he needs in those few minutes, he can defeat Mr. Dahl. And if you're wondering how disconnecting the chest plate will ease his pain, well, apparently when he does that, his heart rate slows dramatically. And it'll eventually become so slow that his nerves will deaden and won't be able to feel any pain. But like I just mentioned, he has to be careful, for if he doesn't reconnect himself within a few minutes, his heart will eventually stop beating altogether, and he'll die. Ultimately, it's a risk he'll have to take, so he disconnects his chest plate and gets to work. After several anxious minutes, and with barely any time to spare, he both completes his device and reconnects his chest plate. So with his device in hand, Iron Man barges into Mr. Dahl's room. As expected, the villain quickly remodels his figure to look like the hero, and manages to do so before Iron Man's done anything to him. But instead of just crushing the figurine, he decides to drop it from shoulder height, a fall that will apparently defeat Iron Man. Yet in the time it takes Mr. Dahl to lift his arm and explain his plan aloud, Iron Man whips out his device, some kind of laser, and fires it at the figurine. Within a matter of milliseconds, Iron Man somehow uses his device's beam to change the figure's likeness from that of himself to Mr. Dahl. By the time the villain realizes this, he's already let go of it. Thus it drops to the ground, causing him to fall unconscious. So with Mr. Dahl finally defeated, Iron Man brings back the factory's guards and turns him over to them. He then leaves to go find Stark, although we know that that just means he's going to change out of his armor and come back. Sure enough, that's exactly what he does. But then, after speaking with his chauffeur, Happy Hogan, he realizes that he's forgotten about Pepper. So he and Happy go to check on her, and although she's completely unharmed, she's bubbling with anger. But after having had her heart broken, and after being locked in an empty room for who knows how long, she has every right to be upset. So she furiously storms out of the room, leaving Stark and Happy to wonder about the nature of women. That concludes Tales of Suspense 48, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a fairly solid story. Like the last few issues, it didn't swing for the fences, but still worked as a straightforward and entertaining adventure. What sets this one apart is of course its introduction of Iron Man's new armor. And boy, what an improvement! Never once, after 9 issues of Tales of Suspense, and 2 of the Avengers, did I think that his bulky gold suit looked any good. To me, it just looked like a medieval knight painted gold. But now, Iron Man finally looks like a sleek, modern hero, who's got the speed and agility to match his strength. As for Mr. Dahl, the villain of the story, well, he wasn't that interesting, but at least he had a unique power set that I'd like to see more of in the future. With that being said, he won't actually make another appearance for 15 years. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.